Fund Balance Classification training. I am taking over this for Catherine, so I'm also still learning it. And I'm still learning Teams, obviously, so please be patient with me. I'm going to start off by just going through the different classifications, and then I'm going to do a quick run through the actual reporting package. I don't think this is going to take a full hour, may not even take 30 minutes, but we should have plenty of time for questions once I'm done. So you have 5 different possible classifications you can use: non-spendable, restricted, committed, assigned, and unassigned. In most instances, you won't really have to select non-spendable if you're filling out the package. Non-spendable will be things that aren't actually in spendable form, like prepaid expenses or the long-term portion of receivables or inventory. Or it can be things that are legally or contractually required to be maintained intact. So if you have a permanent fund, the principal portion of that would be non-spendable. And that would be probably the only thing anyone at an agency level would be reporting to us, because we handle the prepaids and inventory. You have proceeds from the collection of non-current receivables or the sale of property acquired for resale that's restricted, committed, or assigned, then those amounts would be classified as restricted, committed, or assigned, and not non-spendable. So that's one little exception to that. Restricted applies when you have constraints placed on the use of resources. And this is either when you have constraints imposed by creditors, like in a debt covenant, or grantors, contributors, or laws, regulations of other governments. So externally imposed constraints. Can also be from law, from constitutional provisions, or enabling legislation. Enabling legislation authorizes the government to assess, levy, charge, or otherwise mandate payment of resources from external resource providers, and includes a legally enforceable requirement that those resources be used only for specific purposes stipulated in the legislation. So legal enforceability means that a government can be compelled by an external party, like the citizens or the judiciary, to use resources created by enabling legislation only for the purposes specified by the legislation. That's a bunch of legal leads there, but a good example of this that I think most people are probably familiar with is our gas tax that we had that increased over the last 5 or so years. We had enabling legislation, which was Act number 40, passed in 2017, established the Infrastructure Maintenance Trust Fund, and Act number 40 created a revenue source by increasing the state gas tax. And then it also stipulated that all the money in the fund had to be used for the repair, maintenance, or improvements of our existing transportation system. So for it to be enabling legislation, the legislation has to specify the revenue source, and it also has to stipulate how the money has to be spent. If you don't have both of those in there, it's not enabling legislation. It also needs to be legally enforceable by an outside party outside of the government. So I guess technically we as citizens could be upset that the gas tax maybe wasn't used correctly, and maybe could go and take judicial action. Other examples of restricted fund balance are legal settlements that stipulate restrictions, federal grant for school lunches, and pretty much every federal grant is going to be considered restricted. Expendable portion of a permanent fund. So going back to the non-spendable thing, if you have a permanent fund, principal portion would be non-spendable, but anything you can spend would be restricted. And debt proceeds that must be used for a specific purpose based on voter-approved proposition. So like if you're voting for a bond to be issued, that would be an example of that. Permitted. This would be amounts that can only be used for specific purposes determined by formal action of the government's highest level decision-making authority, which for our state would be the legislative or executive branches. The key part of this is it has to be determined by formal action and it has to be by the highest level of decision-making authority. Committed amounts in fund balance can't be used for any other purpose unless the government removes or changes the specified use by taking the same type of action. Like if they use legislation, they'd have to use legislation to actually change the use. It also includes contractual obligations to the extent that the existing resources in the fund have been specifically committed for use in satisfying those contractual requirements. So that would be pretty much any contract you have. If you've committed the funds in there, then that fund balance is committed. You have an outstanding contract. In contrast to restricted, the legislation you have that imposes the restrictions on the use of the committed fund balance is separate from the legislation that created the revenue source. A good example of this is when you get general fund appropriations that specify, a specific purpose and proviso. That would be an example of committed. Another thing to remember about this is the use of the constraints are not legally enforceable for committed like they are for restricted. I think restricted, you can't really redeploy the resources like you can committed, even though it does require formal action to do so. Then you have assigned amounts that are constrained by the government's intent to be used for specific purposes, but they don't meet the criteria to be classified as restricted or committed. So this is kind of a catch-all for it does have a purpose, but it's not restricted or committed, basically. The intent for the purpose should be expressed by the governing body itself or a body such as a budget or finance committee or official, but the governing body has delegated authority to assign amounts to be used for specific purposes. So it should be the state government, legislator, or the governor, or you might have the budget office would be an example of someone who's delegated authority. Some agencies have a commission or board. That could be an instance where they have delegated authority to assign purposes. And then, the management at most agencies also has that authority. Kind of the difference between this and committed is while both of them can be changed, it's not as difficult to change or modify the constraints on assigned. For governmental funds other than the general fund, all remaining positive fund balance that is not classified as non-spendable, restricted, or committed would be classified as assigned. So every fund but the general fund. If you have anything that doesn't fall in those other categories, then it's positive. Then it's assigned if you have a positive balance. It's not true if you have a negative balance, but I'll get to that in a second. Amounts in the general fund are classified as assigned if they meet the criteria above. This stuff over here about the government's intent and all of that. An example of assigned would be a fund that is constrained by agency management for the operations of a specific department or project with the agency, within the agency. So if you have a department that sells law books and you want to just, management just wants to track what they're doing, and everything that goes in that fund must only be spent on their operations, the revenue stays in that fund, that would be an assigned fund balance. And then lastly, unassigned. This is the residual classification for the general fund. So everything in the general fund that doesn't fall in those other categories goes to unassigned. For all the other governmental funds other than the general fund, you would only have an unassigned fund balance if you have a deficit fund balance. So if it's negative, then it goes in this category, but otherwise, those other fund balances should not be unassigned. Examples of unassigned, basically what I just said, the general fund surplus, those deficit fund balances, and the other governmental fund balance classifications, the general reserve fund, and the contingency reserve fund, which the treasurer's office would be the only agency dealing with those.
Y'all are real clear about the unassigned versus everything else. If there's any sort of constraint on it, and the lowest level of constraint is an internal decision on how to use that fund, so it could be some sort of management prerogative on how that fund is going to be used, that is still a constraint on the fund, which would make it not unassigned if there is a management intent. And it has to be somewhat documented. It can't just be, you know, wishful thinking in somebody's head, but some sort of management intent on how that fund is to be used, then it would not be considered unassigned. So the question was, is Fund 2837 generally considered to be part of the general fund if you're required to remit it back to the general fund? Yes, we would, generally speaking, say that it would be considered unassigned. You go in and the balance has traditionally been reported as unassigned, and you are now going to change it to assigned or some other classification. Remember that you're going to have to document on the closing package why you're changing it so that we can present that to the auditors. Any change in fund balance from year to year, any change in classification of fund balance from year to year is going to require documentation for the auditors. It doesn't have to be super long, but you will have to designate, particularly when you come to like restricted, committed, or assigned, you're going to have to designate what the enabling legislation is or what the proviso is and what the restrictions in place on it. So in the example that Layla gave about the gas tax, you would quote, you would provide us the law that is behind your change. And let's just go with an easy one where you're going to change it from unassigned to assigned. Then you want to maybe talk about, well, this fund was set up with a very specific intent to maybe pay for canteen related items at our agency. So it could be something as simple as that. That would satisfy the management intent for use of the fund. But we're just going to need to document because we do present to the auditors. And I can tell you for sure the Senate Finance Committee, you know, they're taking a much more robust look at the ACFR. I have had to answer questions personally on some of y'all's unassigned fund balance based on your response to these packages. So make sure it's good enough that if we get a question about it from somebody under the dome, that we can respond as to why we believe that is unassigned versus assigned or any other level.